Welcome everyone, this is a Legacy School Science lesson for Biology Chapter 4, Ecosystem. This is part 1 of 2 parts. For this part, you will need your Science Checkpoint Book 3, pages 46 to 52. The growth of ecology. When you take a walk in a park or the countryside, some plants or animals may make you stop and look at it. It could be the color or shape of a flower that attracts you, or the activity of an animal such as a bird. About 250 years ago, explorers on voyages of discovery from European countries such as England, Portugal, and Spain did the same thing as they cut their way through rainforest, trekked across plains, and climbed mountains. Some of the explorers examined the living things more closely and considered how they were adapted to their surroundings, just as you did when studying chapter 3. Alexander von Humboldt, a German explorer, made many journeys, and from the data he collected, he noticed that the number of species living in a place increased as he moved from north to the tropics. The idea of different worldwide habitats began to form. Philip Sclater was an English biologist who looked at the distribution of songbirds, such as sparrows, around the world and decided that the Earth could be divided up into regions based on the birds found there. These regions are known as biogeographical realms. Alfred Russel Wallace, a Welsh biologist who had traveled widely, found that other animals he had seen also fitted into Sclater's system of realms. The system continued to be developed, and a modified version of it is still used today. While the idea of realms continued to develop, a German zoologist called Karl Moebius investigated oyster banks on the German coastline to see how they may be formed. From the results of his investigation, he showed how living things interact with each other in their community. This is figure 4.2 that shows the realms. The idea of interaction gathered pace, and Ernest Haeckel, a German biologist, devised the word ecology in the 1860s to describe the relationship between animals, other living things in the environment, and the features of the environment such as the weather and the type of soil. In the following decade, interest in such relationships gradually grew, and by the beginning of the 20th century, ecology, the study of living things in their environment, was established as a science. A vocabulary of ecology. There are a number of special terms that ecologists use frequently, so it is important to know what they mean. Here is a list of the most frequently used words and phrases to give you a quick reference to ecology vocabulary as you study this chapter. Habitat, the place where a plant, animal, or microorganism live. Community. Community, all the plants, animals, and microorganisms that live in a habitat. Environment, the surroundings of a living thing. A complete description of an environment includes all the living things, rocks, soil, and weather condition. Abiotic factor, factors due to the non-living part of the environment, such as weather, rocks, and soil, which may affect the survival of a living thing. Biotic factors, factors in an environment due to living things, such as the amount of food or number of predators, which may affect the survival of a living thing. Ecosystem, the community of living things and the abiotic factors found in a particular place, such as woodland or a pond. Biodiversity, a term used to describe the number and variety of species in an ecosystem. A biome, a large region of the earth generally covered by the same community of plants and animals, and all parts having the same weather. Herbivore, an animal that only eats plant. Carnivore, an animal that only eats other animal. Omnivore, an animal that eats both plants and animals. A predator, an animal that feeds or preys on another animal. A prey, an animal that is eaten or fall a prey to a predator. Producer, an organism that produces food at the beginning of a food chain. It's usually a plant. Consumer, an animal that eats plant, other animals, or both. A primary consumer, an animal that eats plant. This may be a herbivore or an omnivore. Like we said, herbivores eat plants and omnivores eat both plants and other animals. Secondary consumer, an animal that eats primary consumer. This may be a carnivore or an omnivore. Tertiary consumer, an animal that eats secondary consumers, and this may be a carnivore or an omnivore. Quaternary consumers, an animal that eats the tertiary consumer. Top carnivore, the animal at the end of the food chain. A food chain is a description, often a diagram, of the way some organisms in a habitat are linked to each other through feeding. A food chain begins with a producer and is followed by one or more consumers. For example, the grass is eaten by the gazelle is eaten by the lion. Food web is a description, often a diagram, of how a number of food chain in a habitat are linked together to show how food and energy pass through the habitat. So we'll have some talk about food chain. Food chain in the ocean. An animal shown in figure 4.3 is a killer whale. It is an organism at the end of a long food chain. The killer whale is trying to catch a seal. The seal, sensing that the killer whale is close by, have come out of the water. This is not stopping the killer whale from pursuing them. It has swum quickly up the shore and tried to catch a seal by surprise in the surf. In time, the seals will have to return to the sea to catch food for themselves. They feed on a variety of large fish that live off the shore. The large fish in turn feed on smaller fish, sometimes fish of their own species. The smaller fish feed on the larvae of crustaceans such as crabs and lobsters. These larvae do not remain on the rocky bed of the sea like their parents, but swim in the sunlit open waters of the sea. They form part of the planktons, a massive collection of tiny animals and algae. The crab larvae, along with other tiny animals, eat the algae. The algae do not eat anything. They are plant-like microorganisms belonging to the Planktacea kingdom. Like plants, algae make their own food through photosynthesis, and they use energy in sunlight to do it. It is the energy in the sunlight that was trapped in the algae and passed up the food chain that is being used by the killer whale in figure 4.3 as it tries to catch another meal. Food chains around the world. There are food chains in every habitat in the world. Most are not as long as the one you have made in your answer to question 7. Food chains have a particular structure. They begin with an energy source, which is usually the sun. The first organism in the food chain is the one that extracts energy from the sun and uses it to produce food. The organisms are called producers. Any green plant, such as a moss, fern, conifer, or flowering plant, is a producer. Algae are producers too, because plants use photosynthesis. An organism that feeds on a producer is called a primary consumer. It is in turn, it is eaten by a secondary consumer, which in turn is eaten by a tertiary consumer, and so on. Because of their similar structure, we can compare food chain from around the world. For example, in Australia outback, which is an area of desert and grassland, the main producer is grass. A primary consumer is a kangaroo, and a secondary consumer is a wild dog called dingo. In tropical forest, there are many different kinds of plants that are producers. For example, a tree is a producer, and the beetle that feeds on its leaf is a primary consumer. A tree frog feeds on the beetle and is therefore a secondary consumer. A tree snake feeds on the frog and it is a tertiary consumer, and so on. In mountains of Europe, heathers cover large areas of the ground. It is a producer. Mountain hares nibble its shoots and so are primary consumer. The golden eagle feeds on the mountain hare and is a secondary consumer. The energy in food chain. When you eat a radish or a carrot, for example, you eat most of the plant except the leaves. Even if you were to eat the whole plant, you would not take in all the energy that the plant had trapped to make food. While the plant was growing, it used some of the energy to stay alive and to build new materials so that its cell could grow and divide. In similar ways, if you were to be eaten by a predator, it would not receive all the energy that you had taken in from your food. You use energy for life processes such as breathing, digesting your food, and moving your body. You even lose some energy as heat to your surrounding. In fact, all living things lose some heat to their surroundings owing to the chemical reactions that take place inside them to keep them alive. This means that as energy passes along a food chain, some energy is lost from the food chain at every link. Where are your food chains? Look at figure 4.7. Where do all these foods come from? The fruit comes from plants, and the juice comes from plants too. Marmalade is made from oranges. Eggs are laid by hens, which feed on cereal grain, such as maize. A slice of bread is made from the flour of another cereal called wheat, and is spread with margarine made from sunflower oil. Cheese is made from milk, which comes from cows, and the cow gets the material and energy it needs to make milk from the grass it eats. Breakfast cereals are made from maize, oats, and wheat. So this is figure 4.7, showing all of the diversity of the food products and that all of them are coming from different food chain. This is the end of this first part. See you again.